Chapter 7 To Catch a Fish. On the morning of the fourth day at sea, Rickenbacker divided the second orange and passed the meager sections around. By the time Bartek, DeAngelis, Reynolds, and Alex had gone close to 96 hours with nothing but an eighth of an orange to eat. Under normal circumstances, they took in 2,500 calories a day. In the last 4 days, they had consumed 20. Under their reddening skin, blood and liver, muscles and brain waged a battle against starvation. On a normal diet, the body converts food into glucose, a form of sugar, and consumes it for energy. The men had exhausted the supply of food in their bodies 3 days ago. Since then, their cells had been burning stored fat for energy instead of glucose. Already their faces had begun to thin. Bones looked a little more prominent. Now their bodies dug deeper for fuel. Their vital organs harvested protein from the muscle tissue in order to keep functioning. Without a new supply of fuel, each man's body was literally consuming itself to stay alive. Rickenbacker's speech to the men took on a different tone this morning. "You might as well sit down and prepare for a long ride," he told them. They would end up on an island somewhere if they drifted long enough. There was no question in his mind about that. The challenge would be to survive until they did. The men were fast discovering the cruel irony behind being stranded in the ocean. They were starving, and yet they were surrounded by food. The water teemed with sleek, silvery fish, from tiny fingerlings to foot-long jack marrow and plump-looking dolphins. Seabirds circled overhead, diving occasionally to catch their lunch. The men seemed to have attracted their own traveling ecosystem, but all of it lay just beyond their reach. They had fish hooks and line, but without food they had no bait, and without bait they had no food. The orange peels had no interest at all for the fish. Rickenbacker tried adding Adamson's shiny keychain to a lure. Whitaker tied his ring to a line and sunk it. Sometimes a fish would get curious and hover near a hook, so close the men could almost taste it. Each time it would lose interest and dart away. They debated trying to turn the tables on the sharks and convert the fearsome predators into prey. Cherry could probably put a bullet into one of them at close range. But if he didn't kill it, what would happen? The wounded creature would flail around, trailing blood in the water. Imagine the 12-foot monsters thrashing around the rafts, whipped into a frenzy by the scent of blood. They decided it was best to let the sharks be. The seabirds were another source of frustration. At first they had seemed a surefire sign that land was near. Now it was clear the men had misunderstood the habits of seabirds. These creatures were perfectly at home many miles from land. They taunted the men, darting and hovering in sight, but well out of reach. It's not as though the scrawny birds would be much of a meal, but if they could just get their hands on one, they might be able to use the meat for bait. Every day, now and then, he'd take a shot, but he never came close to hitting a bird. Bartek tormented himself by watching the birds fish. They'd flap low, scanning for prey, and then drop with a splash. An instant later, they rose with a meal. Just like that. Bartek wasn't normally much of a philosopher, but his sister's death, and now his own close encounter with the end, had pushed his mind to a dark place. All around them, creatures with brains no bigger than the tip of Bartek's little finger found food with ease. Here they were, 8 members of the smartest species on Earth. Between them, they had decades of education and specialized training. Bartek himself knew how to fix some of the most complex machines ever made. But out here, it was all meaningless. All they could do was pray that a careless bird might drop a fish in their laps. Day 4 turned to 5 and 5 to 6. Adamson could barely move his arms, but each day he scratched the date onto the side of the raft. October 24, October 25, October 26. The men started passing Bartek's Bible around and choosing passages to read. Whitaker mostly kept his mouth shut when they did. He wasn't a believer. What good was praying to do? They were on their own out here. Each night they set up flares until the one got to work. When it burned out and left them in darkness, it made them feel like the only people left in the world. On the 5th morning, they gave up on Rickenbacker's rationing plan and ate the 3rd orange. It was dry as the inside of their mouths. The last one started to rot, and they devoured it on the 6th day. Now the real torture set in. For the first few days, they had at least been able to look forward to something, even if it was a tasteless piece of orange they could eat in one bite. By the time the sun baked off the chill of the fifth night and began to roast them alive, they had nothing left but a relentless need for food. They were desperately thirsty too, but right now it was hunger that held them captive every waking minute of the day. As if they could lay out their fantasies on a table and carve them up, the men dreamed up 5-course meals in their heads and shared them with one another. Captain Cherry posed as a waiter at one of San Francisco's finest restaurants. He went around the rafts taking orders. There was always fruit juice to start, then steaks and roasts and chops and turkey. Everyone wanted lemon, their bodies starving for vitamin C. The milkshakes from the officers' club at Hickam Field were in high demand, and strawberry was the flavor of choice. If they ever got off the rafts, they agreed, they'd all have one another over for dinner. Bartek offered up his mother's Polish meatballs and cabbage with apple pie for dessert. D'Angelo said his mother would make spaghetti. Reynolds invited everyone to his parents' ranch in Northern California, where they'd feast on fried chicken, followed by cake and pie. Bartek managed to keep his sense of humor for a while. When the men in the Air Transport Command traveled, they collected $6 a day from the Army for expenses. One thing about being lost at sea, Bartek said, the expenses were pretty light. He ended every day by tallying up their earnings. Well, he'd say, that's another $6 for us. It was good for a few laughs, but nothing could keep their minds off of food for long. Rickenbacker watched with irritation as hunger and exhaustion tore away at the morale of the crew. Simple tasks took almost heroic effort, and the rafts required constant attention. Between the sea spray and the tiny leaks in the canvas, water collected incessantly at their feet. To stay afloat, everyone had to help bail out the rafts. They used the collapsible rubber buckets and sometimes their hats to shovel water back into the sea, only to watch it fill at the bottom of the rafts again. When they weren't bailing, someone was laboring over the hand pump, trying to keep invisible leaks from deflating the rafts. During the first couple of days, it was a 15-minute task to get the side tubes fully blown up. Now, one man had trouble finishing it without handling the pump over to a raft mate and collapsing it from fatigue. It was hard work just staying afloat, and the men were beginning to wonder if there was any point in doing it. Despite Rickenbacker's pep talks, DeAngelis had decided, after the third day, that they were pretty much doomed. Pain had turned Adamson into a bitter, grumbling lump in the corner of Rickenbacker's raft. Radioman Jim Reynolds, who was thin to begin with, had started to waste away. He barely said a word and looked like he wouldn't last long without food. Sergeant Alex looked the worst of the lot. A white paste had formed at the corners of his mouth. He sat in the donut and moaned for water, or mumbled the name of his girlfriend over and over. Her nickname was Snooks, and it took a while for the men to figure out what he was talking about. Finally, Rickenbacker got tired of listening to the moaning. In his mind, despair was a contagious disease, and Alex was showing symptoms. If they were going to survive out here, everyone had to believe it was not just possible, but certain. Any sign of doubt had to be stamped out quickly and ruthlessly. No one could be allowed to quit. He roped the donut in close and lashed out at Alex. "Why the heck can't you take it?" he demanded. After all, Alex wasn't the only one suffering, and there were thousands more boys out there fighting for their lives in unbearable conditions. American soldiers stuck in waterlogged foxholes eating meager rations of rice and beans. Alex explained meekly that he had been recovering from jaundice and appendicitis. He'd only been out of the hospital for a couple of weeks, and he'd gotten some kind of lip or gum infection. He also admitted he'd been leaning over the side of the donut and drinking the salt water. "I tried not to, but I had to," he moaned. "I just had to have water." Rickenbacker turned away and left the donut drift back to the end of its 20-foot tether. They'd better find food and water soon, he thought, or Alex wasn't going to make it. Hunger filled the empty hours of the day and night. Their minds groped for solutions, real or imagined. At one point, Cherry was baiting a hook with yet another useless piece of orange peel when he wondered out loud if fingernails would work as bait. Bartek said no. It would take a real piece of flesh to make a fish bite. "What part would you see?" asked Whitaker. Bartek claimed he used an earlobe because they didn't serve any purpose. "You'd never miss it," he said. Whitaker suggested the tip of a finger. Reynolds wanted to use a piece of tow because no one would ever notice it was missing. It had started to idle it had started as idle chatter, but everyone knew it was a real option. They needed bait, and if they had to use their own flesh, shouldn't they do it? Adamson warned that the blood from the fingertip or an earlobe might aggravate the sharks. That didn't seem like much of a threat after a week at sea with their constant companions. But no one was quite ready to slice off an earlobe for the chance of catching a fish. The conversation passed with all body parts intact. The talk of using human flesh as bait, however, brought them uncomfortably close to a last-ditch measure that no one was willing to mention aloud. At sea, when the men grew desperate enough, they had been known to eat one another to survive. In 1820, the whale ship Essex was rammed by a giant sperm whale about 2,500 miles east of where the three rafts were now drifting. In the 3 months lost at sea, the 8 survivors of the Essex consumed 7 of their companions. In one case, they didn't even wait for a boatmate to die. They drew lots, and the unlucky sailor who picked the short stick was sacrificed for a meal. They drew again to decide who would shoot him. The practice was common enough that it was part of an unwritten code known as the custom of the sea. As long as the lots were drawn fairly, no court of law considered it murder. Most sailors had to be on the verge of death before they resorted to cannibalism, but everyone had a different threshold. It took the castaways from the Essex 2 months before they started saving dead bodies for food. In 1884, the crew of the English yacht Mignonette lasted 20 days before they killed and ate their 17-year-old captain boy. Rickenbacker, Whitaker, Bartek, and the rest of the crew had now been adrift for a week.